And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us, where links to our new Liberty News page can be found, where links to both our YouTube page and our podcast page can be found. We appreciate folks who have taken the time over the last few weeks and stepped up our exposure, if you will, on social media. For independent media, social media is our mother's milk. It's our way of getting out to the world. We all struggle in increasingly challenging times to fight through the noise. Dare I use the word fake news? The white noise that has been created by what passes for politics these days, which is essentially glorified PR. We fight and struggle to get past the walls of press release journalism, who for much of the major media, news constitutes really a regurgitation of whatever spin been generated by the particular side of the aisle that's supported by that outlet. We're well beyond that, and nothing is better evidenced that by our guest tonight. Joining me for the first time in a little bit of a while, it's been way too long, is a gentleman who's got 25 plus years experience in investigating reporting at the senior newspapers in the greater Arizona region. He spent a couple of years at the Goldwater Institute, left to go to the Washington Examiner, where he spearheaded an incredible expose on the comings and goings, if you will, the grotesque operational inefficiencies at the Veterans Administration. He joins us back again, having renewed his stint at the Goldwater Institute as the lead investigative reporter for an entire division now that focuses on investigative reporting. Of course, I'm talking about Mark Flatten. Mark, welcome back to the Coalition.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, now, I know you're short on time, so I want to get to the meat of this as quickly as possible. Years ago, my sister, many years ago, got at that time was one of the first masters in public administrations, if you will, in the nation. And that was really going back into the 70s when you had the burgeoning, if you will, of the not-for-profit NGO governmental sector. Explosions of bureaucracies, both in Washington and at the state level, presented medical institutions with a whole nother range of challenges. And first and foremost among it, and was one of her first jobs, was managing what was called certificates of needs. At the time, certificates of needs were preached to the layman, people like myself, as something that would create operational efficiency. You had 2 or 3 hospitals in a crowded urban corridor. You necessarily didn't want 3 of the state-of-the-art bazillion-dollar, flux capacitor / EKG machines. At least that's what was spun to the public. Now, flash forward, well, it seems like a lifetime, literally. We're faced with explosive health costs around the nation. We're faced with a consolidation of major medical companies. We're faced with the balkanization of the healthcare industry. We're faced with challenges by the federal government who would seek to quote-unquote control and regulate the industry to gain greater cost advantages when anything but that is happening. Now, we're even facing in D.C. an area that we've covered at length, things like price controls. And anyone who actually didn't sleep through their freshman economic class understands how that works out. But you've done a major piece, and we focused on that, and we shared one of the 2 videos. We'll share a second video tomorrow on our social media here, talking about certificate of needs. Give us a little history. What went wrong?
Well, basically what happened is in the 1970s, the federal government got this bright idea that if you limit access, if you limit the number of medical facilities, maybe somehow that would control costs, but completely ignored the idea that competition would improve quality and reduce costs, which is what it traditionally does. In less than 10 years, everybody kind of realized, this didn't work. But basically, these laws were already on the books that said if you want to build a new medical facility or expand an existing facility, you have to get the government's permission to do that. And by the early 80s, the federal government had come to the conclusion this just did not work. So they urged states to start repealing these laws. The problem is the existing medical providers in these communities realized, hey, these laws are great, because what they do is they allow us to operate as essentially a monopoly. They are a very effective tool for keeping competition out. And so what has happened is these local medical providers have essentially used these certificate of need laws to enforce monopolies in their service areas. And so there are now 38 states that have some form of certificate of need laws, even though the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, the American Medical Association have all repeatedly for decades said you need to repeal these laws because they're a failure. And this is not a partisan issue. Since 2004, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, now the Trump administration has tried to get states to repeal these laws. But these states are far more compliant with sort of the local powers that be than they are from nudging from the federal government.
It can be said largely that there's an arms race going on amongst hospitals, both in terms of mergers and consolidation and increasing, if you will, their equipment level. That's what's been played to the public. Is that really an invention, as you say, of local politics and the sales machines of big pharma and big healthcare?
Well, the reality is the thing that is going to drive down costs and improve quality, and this isn't me talking, there's been study after study, both government studies and independent studies, that have said the effect of these laws is to drive up the cost of medical care and to drive down the quality of medical care. And it's pure simple economics. I mean, if I have a hospital and I have the only MRI machine for 100 miles, I can pretty much charge whatever I want. I don't care how long my lines are. I don't have to give my customers very good service. But if you open an MRI machine across the street and say, hey, we can do it for half the cost and we can get you out of here in an hour, well, suddenly you've got a competitive environment. And what the competition is going to do is it's going to make me do my job better, and it's going to make me cut my costs. Now, the existing providers don't like that. As in any monopoly situation, they like to keep the things as they are.
Now, how far down into the medical food chain does this occur? Now, obviously you've got in cities like Providence and Boston, and particularly in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, these major medical centers. We all know about this because we all watch doctor shows on TV. Makes us an expert, I suppose. But ultimately, you've also got regional hospitals, you've got smaller community hospitals, religious affiliated hospitals, and now it would appear that one of the great potentials to introducing competition at perhaps the worst performing end of the medical system, which is the emergency room, you've got these urgent care facilities. How encroaching are these laws on the state level?
Well, they vary from state to state. Some states have very restrictive laws I mean, if you want to add an MRI machine, you've got to go through this long bureaucratic process to get the state's permission. Others have fairly minimal laws. A couple of states have repealed their certificate of need laws. I think about a dozen of them do not have certificate of need laws. And so the Mercatus Center has actually done a lot of studies on this, and they found that whether it be an urban or a rural setting, that the economics of these certificate of need laws is the same. When you eliminate competition, you reduce quality and increase cost. That's been across the board. And it's by a substantial number. I mean, it's not a minor reduction in quality, and it's not a minor increase in cost. It's very substantial.
Can you give us some statistics? What is this, in some of the states, and I know you've focused in a particular region, and you focused as well on mental health care. What are some of the costs associated with this?
Well, you've got the upfront costs. I mean, let me just tell you what happened in Iowa. You had a company that wanted to come. Iowa has this severe shortage of inpatient mental health beds, to the point that if someone has a mental health crisis, they have no place to take them. So what happens is they wind up in emergency rooms, they wind up in jails, and they don't have the facilities to deal with them, neither an emergency room nor a jail. And so what happens is since they don't have a bed to take them to, they might sit for days, literally handcuffed to a hospital bed if they're in the hospital, or locked in a small cell in isolation if they are in jail. And in fact, the largest mental health provider in the United States is the Los Angeles County Jail, which is kind of astounding. And so what we had in Iowa, we had a private company that wanted to come in and use its own money with no tax breaks, no incentives, no sweeteners from the state, nothing like that. They saw the need there. They came in and they said, we want to build a new mental health facility. It'll be privately operated. The existing providers in the area stepped up and did everything they could using the certificate of need process to prevent that. And they ended up dragging it out for more than 2 years. Now, you've got the upfront cost, the application, the delays, all your top executives and lawyers and everybody else that has to come sit through these hearings. But what they also did is they exacerbated this problem for more than 2 years. And actually, the only reason that they were ever actually able to get their certificate of need is because the governor got so fed up with this process that he eventually intervened and said, "This is ridiculous, folks. There's clearly a need in our community for this facility, and there's really no reason that you're using these bureaucratic certificate of need laws to block this." I mean, I talked to county sheriffs who described that on an almost daily basis. What happens is if somebody winds up in their jail, they go to the phones and they start calling inpatient mental hospitals all over the state. Have you got a bed available? Have you got a bed available? You might find one that's 300-400 or across the state. You might be in Des Moines and find one in Davenport or a couple hundred miles away. And so sheriff's deputies have to transport these people, and they say it goes on a daily basis. In fact, they said often, our deputies will be driving someone east because we found a hospital bed to the east, and we'll pass a deputy from another sheriff's office driving west because they found a hospital bed in the west. So that's what you get when you try to artificially limit the access to this care.
The astounding part of this is that I would imagine you've got one part of state government advocating for this because of political connections, and again, the ever-present presence, if you will, of government who seems intent on building fortresses for protected industries. On the other side of government, you've got a significant amount, I would imagine, of out-of-pocket costs by the state in the form of subsidies and in the form of outright costs for these added expenses, don't you? I mean, is one side not talking to the other?
Well, you definitely have that cost shifting. I mean, instead of putting a person in a qualified mental health facility where you can treat them, get them on medications, get them the care they need, and maybe get them on a straight path and get them back into society where you can deal with them on an outpatient basis. Instead of doing that, you're putting them in jail. The cost of putting these folks in jail is a lot higher than providing the adequate medical care at the beginning. Just apples and apples comparisons of the cost. But then you've also got the longer term cost, because if I'm sitting in jail for a week because there's no mental health beds available, I'm costing that sheriff's office, the cost of housing me for a week. And when I get out, I'm no better than when I went in. So, treatment doesn't start until you get out of jail. In a lot of these small sheriff's office, I mean, you have, a half dozen deputies patrolling, a large county. It's really difficult to try and find a deputy who can take literally an entire day to drive this individual all the way across the state for that one coveted mental health bed. You're taking that deputy out of the community. You're taking him off patrol.
Right.
So there are all kinds of costs associated. It's both direct cost of housing that person in your jail or in the emergency room, but also the fact that you're not doing them any good when they're there.
Right. Now, add to that, of course, the phenomenal toll that the respective methamphetamine crisis and separately the opioid crisis, the toll that those crises have placed on local law enforcement. I guess the question is, at what point in time do these systems simply start to break down? Because, here in the Northeast, at least we've got, some concentration, higher per capita law enforcement counts, things like that. We've got agreements between communities. But again, you're in vast parts of the country, as you pointed out, law enforcement is already stretched to the limit, literally to the limit. And then on top of that, you've got the budgetary crisis at the state and county levels because of either A, declining tax revenue, and or B, pension and OPEB issues on top of that. So you've got this mess that's just, fighting with each other, bringing government to its heels. Now, I want government to go away. I just didn't want it to go away in this matter because people will continue to suffer. Now, what states seem on the verge of changing that, or where do you see any impetus for change whatsoever?
Well, some states have moved in the deregulatory direction. Some states, notably Indiana, has kind of moved the other way. They did not have a certificate of need process, but in the last year or so, they've implemented one. So actually, the National Conference of State Legislatures has a very good map showing states with their individual certificate of need laws.
So how does Indiana justify that? I mean, against all... and astonishingly, from what you're telling me, you're actually getting pressure from the federal government, possibly because of federal health care programs having to pay for some of this stuff. But how is this justified? Or does government even attempt to justify actions like this anymore?
Well, at this point, you've got this strange interaction in sort of medical reimbursement. You've got federal money, you've got state money, you've got all that other stuff. And the federal government they don't want to basically come in and write 50 specific state plans. So what the federal government has been doing since at least 2004 and even before that is they've been going to these states and essentially trying to lobby them to change their laws. The Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice has been very active, again, through both Republican and Democratic administrations to get states to change these laws. But states are just very reluctant to do it, in part, I think, because of the pressure they get from the existing providers in their community who paint these doom and gloom scenarios. I mean, the typical scare tactic they use is, well, if you let a new hospital come in, like for instance the one in Iowa. The argument's made that, well, they're going to bleed off all the private insurance patients and we'll just be stuck with charity care. The Federal Trade Commission actually did some studies on that, and they said there's absolutely no evidence of that. But it's an effective scare tactic, and it's one thing to get a nasty note from the Department of Justice, Deputy Under Assistant Secretary in Washington, when you've got the president or CEO of the largest hospital chain in your state, who's got a big payroll and employs a lot of people sitting across from you saying, no, that'd be a mistake, Governor. You don't want to do that. So there just has not been this political coalescence in most of these states in terms of actually going out and starting to repeal these things.
So you see a lot of the pressure to do this coming between the relationship between employers and or heads of state government. Are any of the, ironically, one of the most dynamic markets on the planet these days are medical device manufacturers who, continue to exceed all expectations in terms of product development and or innovation. The science continues unabated regardless of what's happening in Des Moines. Are the medical manufacturers, are they kicking back at all? I mean, ultimately this limits their sales. Are they exercising any clout?
I don't think that they're the ones that are particularly involved. I mean, from the research I've done, it is more of a local issue. You've got a large hospital chain in whatever county you live in, and they'll come in and tell gloom and doom stories about how if you repeal this law, gee, we employ 6,000 people in this county, and if you repeal the law, we'll probably have to lay people off. I mean, if you're a legislator who's dealing with 20 other things, the easiest thing to say as a legislator is no.
Right.
So it's just hard to get that to coalesce in terms of that. I want to mention another anecdote in terms. You mentioned the opioid crisis. The videos are kind of based on the story we did about a year ago, looking at
Right.
several states. And in Tennessee, there was a private company that wanted to come in and open a methadone clinic in Johnson City. The nearest facility at that time was 50 miles away in a different state. And for the first period of methadone treatment, you have to drive every single day to get your methadone. So you had people literally driving 100 miles a day as they're trying to shake their methadone habit. What happened there is the existing providers in the community, again, used the certificate of need process to block them from opening this new facility. And after the state rejected the application, those existing providers then came in a couple of years later and got their own certificate of need approved unanimously. So that's very illustrative of how these existing companies can use these laws to really manipulate the market, keep out their competitors, and essentially ensure that if there is any change, they're going to be the beneficiaries of it. In fact, in Iowa, the existing providers had a couple of years before issued a report saying that inpatient mental health care is in crisis in Iowa. They'd issued that report, and of course their conclusion was, we're the only ones that can fix it. But when the new company came in and wanted to build a new mental health facility, they said, oh no, there's no problem here. So they did a complete 180-degree turn on their assessment of the mental health situation in Iowa based on who was filing that application.
Wow. Huh. So, certificates of needs. I've always tended to focus on, the EKG machine, the different hyper expensive tools, perhaps involved in tumor treatments, the type of thing that you see on public television, the latest advances, in terms of machines for healthcare. What you're telling me then is this certificate of need now is being extrapolated across bed space, across staffing issues as well. Is this how broad do individual states like Iowa, let's use them as an example, because as you pointed out, this is very much a state-by-state issue. How broad are these definitions for what you have to apply for certificate of need too?
Oh, some states cover just about anything. Hospitals, long-term care facilities, dialysis centers, MRIs, ambulances, birthing centers, things like that. Some states actually have less restrictive laws and cover fewer types of services. So, for instance, some states just apply it to long-term care nursing facilities. And just as an illustration of the how this cuts across traditional political lines, California actually has no certificate of need process. So a very liberal state that has gotten rid of theirs. And then you look at some of the other states in the South, particularly like Mississippi, they've got them for hospitals, long-term care facilities, chemical dependency, nursing facilities. This is not a partisan political issue. Some of the states that are very strongly Democrat, that you would expect to have very stringent certificate of need laws, actually have some either none or very minimal ones. Other states you might traditionally think of as Republican have very stringent ones. Well, so again, it's not a partisan issue. It's really a local economic issue.
Well, as a libertarian who often lumps the two parties together as the duopoly, it is not surprising to me to see Republicans engaged in activities which would control markets, while at the same time draping themselves in the flag of Main Street America.
Sure.
So
you mentioned the MRI machine. I mean, just say, if I've got my MRI machine here and I'm the only game in town, I can pretty much charge what I want.
Right.
Like I say, but if you open an MRI machine across the street from me, from me, suddenly my costs are going to have to come down or I'm going to go out of business.
Right.
I mean, it's pure economics. It's just very simple economics that the more you control the availability of any commodity, the higher the price is going to go.
Right. Government continues to inject themselves into the marketplace as a barrier to entry or as an authority or decision maker, as a gatekeeper, if you will. And at that time, and let's look at a couple of extremes. You know, by being this gatekeeping presence, you prohibit, you lessen the ability of the healthcare market to react in a nimble manner to burgeoning crises. And as we've all seen over the last 20 or 30 years, you know, there is this sort of stealth period of time where, whether it be, again, the meth crisis, the opioid crisis is now on every politician's tongue from sea to shining sea. But we all know that this has been going on for a number of years, and the government was largely in a state of denial because of other pressures from big pharma. So, you know, government is often the last to recognize what the exigent needs are of a marketplace, and the folks who are, you know, looking for opportunity to engage as an entrepreneur, and I point out often here, because there are so many barriers in the Northeast to these urgent care centers propping up because they represent competition to this same base, that, you know, the entrepreneurial aspect of healthcare is blunted significantly because of this attempt to have a planned economy in healthcare, and the people who suffer are the ratepayers, because ultimately these costs are passed on to the consumer in one form or another, and or people who may find themselves tragically right in the eyes of any one of a number of serious illnesses, tragedies, or addictions. The human cost is incalculable when this happens.
Well, again, a good example of that is the example I cited from Johnson City, Tennessee. Johnson City in Tennessee was rated, I believe, as the 8th or 9th most opioid-addicted community in the United States.
Wow.
And yet when this application was filed, the existing providers actually were able to convince the Certificate of Need Board that there was no need for a treatment facility in that community. Now, that just defies common sense.
Right. Talk about that, because, you know, ultimately, as you and I know, and folks who are, you know, able to, you know, they're concerned with their lives, and it's difficult. It's so toxic these days, the political climate. Folks aren't really that aware of what happens with these, I call these boards the quasis. These are very often appointed local boards they're all very often politically motivated. There is a direct connection, if you will, between the purse strings of government and or these appointees. And I'm generalizing broadly here. Obviously, I'm painting with a very, very large brush. But the two questions I'd love to know from your research, you know, how hyper-local, how much control do these boards have? And you know, in filing a certificate of need, what type of costs and time delays, as again, painting broadly, do you see?
Well, I can't put a dollar figure on it, but let's just walk through what happened in Iowa. They filed their application, which comes with a lot of cost, not just to file it, but also to prepare it. I mean, these things are binders full of legal documents that they have to prepare.
Right.
It took them, you know, they file their application, they go through all of their hoops. They finally get to a board hearing, and the hearing was all day long, something like 12 hours or 10 hours. Where they had their top executives there, they had their lawyers there, they had however many people there, just for that one hearing. Well, the board ended up voting 2-2, you know, so they didn't accept it, they didn't reject it. So they had to go essentially through that whole process again, another full day hearing, and again, they didn't approve it, they didn't reject it. This was on the third hearing, as I recall. Again, these are all day long hearings with all of their, you know, their whole crew with them to get that. This took more than 2 years for a project that, again, they wanted to use their own money without any subsidies, without any tax breaks. So you take that, you know, 2 years with your top executives, your top lawyers tied up in this process. There's a lot of costs associated with that, and that's just to file one application in one state.
Right. That has nothing to do with the construction costs, the equipment costs,
Nothing.
hiring professionals, Um,
No, this is just a certificate of need process.
right,
Once you've cleared that and you've spent however many hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that,
right,
then you got to do all that other stuff.
right.
And there's certainly no guarantee you're going to get the certificate of need after you spent all that time and money.
Right. And in fact, as is any of these boards, I'm going to guess, just kind of throw this out there, that there's an appeals process and there's plenty of litigation that can ensue depending on the outcome and depending who the players are. Just going to throw that out there.
I believe it's going to vary from state to state, but in most states, I think the appeals process is fairly limited. Now, you can sue them in court. There was a company in Oregon that tried to open a hospital there, and it was rejected, and they ended up suing them and went into arbitration, and that dragged on for years and years and years, and they finally just filed a new application. But there really is not much recourse, and that's frankly why the governor of Iowa at the time got so frustrated with it. Is you had this company, you had a clear need in the state,
Right.
and this company could not get what seemed like a very common sense certificate. And the governor finally intervened. He didn't tell them what to do, but he basically let it be known, this is ridiculous, folks. I mean, let's start acting rational here.
Right.
They finally approved it after approximately 2.5 years. But it's very illustrative of the bureaucratic hoops that you have to jump through because of this certificate of need process.
Right. And literally, as you pointed out, what is it? You said 38 states have this?
You get different estimates of 36 to 38. I go by the National Conference of State Legislatures, which actually does a pretty good job of tracking this. They list 38 states. The reason for the discrepancy is some states have a certificate of need process. They just don't call it that. They have some other board that has a different name, but according to NCSL, it's 38 states that have them currently.
Right. Adding yet another layer of cost in healthcare in America, which we clearly don't need, and adding an additional level of drama to people's lives who are, quite frankly, just on a simple human level are just suffering needlessly.
And that was what was so stark in Iowa, is you had in these hearings, you had sheriff's officers or county sheriffs getting up describing the fact that they have no place to take someone in a mental health crisis, so they hold them in jail for several days as they're trying to find a bed, and they might have to drive all across the state to get to that one bed that's open that day. You had medical providers, emergency room physicians who got up and testified, we get these folks into our hospital all the time because they have no place else to go. But we don't really have the ability to deal with them because we're medical facilities. We're not mental health facilities. So you might have someone in a serious mental health crisis wandering around an emergency room if they're not handcuffed to a bed, disrupting other patients, disrupting doctors, disrupting the staff. You had all of this testimony about all of this glaring need in Iowa for this new facility, and yet to this certificate of need board, we don't see a problem here because the existing providers in the area, we're telling them, there's no problem, and if there is a problem, we're the only ones that can fix it.
Right.
And they bought it. They bought it there. They bought it in Tennessee. They bought it in Oregon.
Color me unsurprised. Again, government, despite all evidence to the contrary, continues to inject themselves in a variety of ways and a variety of issues into what can be a successful free market enterprise and ends up literally destroying those that they at least say they're intent on protecting.
Well, and again, I mean, you've got the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Trump administration, all speaking with one voice, saying these things are counterproductive, and yet states are still very reluctant to repeal them.
Right. And as someone who believes in states' rights and states' control, it's agonizing to even suggest that there be some type of quote-unquote federal solution. On the other hand, ironically, it was the Right to Try movement that your organization championed so tirelessly so many years that was it was the federal government ultimately at some level that came in and finally sealed the deal for the remaining states who just simply refused to look at common sense and approach it from an issue where so much support had been given by organizations like Goldwater in dealing with everything from constitutional to litigational to healthcare issues. Really, all the work had been done, all the heavy lifting had been done, and yet you still have, as I call it, state legislatures gone mad. It's heartbreaking. It really is. I want to take and I know you've been with us a little longer. I know you've got plans for this evening. The type of work,
no, that's fine.
The type of work that you've been able to produce in the years that you've been back with Goldwater is astonishing. If you could give us some flavor at a time and a date where so much of the media, so much of the reporting media, is being insulted, if you will, nationally by so many different forces. The level of commitment to a report, and this is why, folks, it's so important. We've provided all sorts of links. We'll continue to the Goldwater webpage, to this report. We'll be sharing the videos repeatedly over the next couple of weeks that they've done. What type of commitment does this take by you and Goldwater to produce this type of effort? Try and give us some flavor, because I have a feeling people just, not through ignorance, but simply don't understand what it takes you folks to do this work.
Well, it takes months to research a project like this. You've got to look at the laws in various states. You've got to find, the best state to tell the story. Then you've got to do all of your research on their laws, their procedures. This case, you've got to go through the entire case. You've got to talk to the people involved. So a project this can take several months to produce. And actually, just a little background as to why Goldwater and a lot of other nonprofit organizations have added journalists like myself. I spent my entire career at traditional newspapers, but anyone that understands what's going on in the newspaper industry now knows that they're kind of drying up and blowing away. Well, historically, an organization like Goldwater would somewhat rely on the investigative reporting that was done by the traditional media. When I would produce an investigative report at one of the newspapers I would work in, you'd have public policy organizations like Goldwater that would come in and say, you've identified a serious problem, we'll come up with ways to fix it. But as the news media has continued to shrink, one of the first things to go was traditional investigative reporting, because it's time consuming, it's expensive, and very often the reports you produce don't get a lot, you're not going to get as many clicks as Britney Spears or Miley Cyrus. Right. So it's very difficult to do that kind of work, but it's important to root out and identify these problems. And that's why a lot of nonprofits like Goldwater have begun adding investigative reporting positions, because it's to root out this kind of problem that traditional newspapers used to do, but just don't have the money or willingness to do it anymore. Right.
No, it's fabulous stuff. And I grew up in an era, listen, I'm old enough to remember Geraldo Rivera breaking the news on how mental health care was treated in New York City, and that literally changing the world. And I remember the original reporting, not just the historical perspective. So it's critically important, and yet at the same time, it's enormously expensive. I mean, you're out there doing original research. You're questioning and covering an area that a whole lot of people don't really want to talk about. No one's chafing at the bit, if you will, to come and tell you about how they've just obstructed the construction of a mental health care facility that has the potential to literally put thousands of people at ease in just one urban center. No one's really interested in going into that in depth, are they?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's very time consuming, and if you did not have organizations like Goldwater stepping up to do that kind of work, there are very few outlets that are still doing it. So it would just go unreported. If I'm a struggling newspaper somewhere in Arizona or in Iowa, am I going to spend the time and money and resources to fully investigate a certificate of need law? Probably not. But in the old days, maybe, yeah, because there's great stories to be had there, but they do take a lot of digging out.
Well, and that's why the video component of this, to me, was so visually arresting. We are a visual society now. I call most media now short attention span theater because of just folks. It's seeming. I'm old enough to remember when movies you had an intermission because a movie took 3.5 hours and you weren't disturbed by that. You were thrilled by it. So that's how far we've come to the point where most movies are about 79 minutes now, and people are wrestling about in their seats. The ability of Goldwater, both at their website and on the videos you presented, to present a visually arresting yet content-laden yet dramatic story that then hopefully leads to an examination of the underlying facts really changes the whole ballgame. And you're right. You're able to, at Goldwater, complete the circle in a way that few organizations in this country, if not this world, can do. As always, anytime I've talked to you, my hat's off to you for the thoroughness of complex investigations, simultaneously making them wildly accessible to literally anyone who wants to watch at any level. And then you're driven, you're pulled right into it, like a good airplane read. For God forbid.
Well, that's I guess that's the difference between a journal, what a journalist does and what an academic researcher does. Mm-hmm. I mean, you need to dig down and get the same facts and figures. But as a journalist, I'm not going to tell you a bunch of numbers. I'm going to tell you the human stories. I'm going to tell you, about this autistic kid that winds up chained to a hospital bed for a week. I'm going to tell you about that guy. I'm going to tell you about the methadone or the heroin addict that wants to shake the habit, that has to drive 50 miles a day over backwood roads to get treatment. So that's what a journalist does. Is they don't just rely on statistics and numbers. They tell how this affects the lives of real people, and hopefully that's what I've accomplished with this. I know that the video is very powerful when folks watch it, because that's what we set out to do. We didn't set out to tell a story about numbers. We set out to tell a story about people, and hopefully we were able to accomplish that.
Well, I think you have, and in a way that brings real meaning to the sum of all your work down there in Arizona. As always, I want to thank you for taking time on a Friday night to join us. Tell folks how they can find you, find your work, and I don't know. I'll always ask you this. You haven't said, you've never given me a tip yet, but is there anything you're working on right now that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I've got a couple of different things going, and we'll definitely keep you in the loop. I would encourage people to go to goldwaterinstitute.org for a general website, and if they want to find the specific story we're talking about today, you can just do a search for Goldwater Institute Con Job, CONJOB, which was the best headline we could think of in explaining what certificate of need laws are.
No, it's damn straight. You've got a big dinner coming up, I know, this fall, and you've got a couple of highfalutin Congress types speaking out. And so how can folks either go to that, or how can they contribute to Goldwater, because you really are changing people's lives?
Really, the best way to do it is to go through our website. We have information on the dinner, and we also have information on how folks can help us continue to do the work we're doing.
Well, again, Mr. Flatt, thank you so much. You grace us by your appearance, and your work has the capacity to change the world. So congratulations on this effort and the entire work at the Goldwater team.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to talking to you again.
We will very soon. Mark Flatt, he's the investigative reporter, if you will, for the Goldwater Institute. Now, again, as he mentioned, we traditionally think about think tanks. We traditionally have this image of ivy-laden walls with oak desks and library books, but the reality has changed. Organizations like Goldwater have reinvented, actually, they've just blown up the model and created something new that's exciting and challenging. GoldwaterInstitute.org. Of course, you see videos about the con job, if you will, certificate of needs, what it's doing, how it's impacting your life and the life of folks in your community, and how government, in conjunction with local institutions, are effectively instituting an embargo, if you will, and competition and growth and innovation in healthcare in your community. And congratulations, having you pay more for it. We're going to take about a 5 or 6 or 7 minute break. We've got a breaking story that we're working on, and has to do with Cranston, Rhode Island. Diversity, rigging jobs, if you will, rigging school board appointments. Stay tuned. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of a few 100,000 stories. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, the mothership, coalitionradio.us, where links to our new Liberty News page, which we're going to rename our Civil Liberty News page, to keep you abreast of the latest developments in the world of your liberty and civil liberties. There are organizations like Cato, Goldwater, Fire, and of course, right here in Little Rhodey. Folks, give us a couple minutes. We'll be right back.